Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little different. You're not storming a castle or fleeing from plague rats. Not tonight. No, this time you're waking up in a medieval village. Your eyelids are still heavy. The straw mattress beneath you creaks when you stretch, and your breath curls in the cold morning air. The sun hasn't even fully risen yet, but the village rooster has declared war on your sleep schedule anyway. And now, groggily, you must rise and face the one thing that unites medieval folks across all social classes: breakfast. Though don't expect pancakes and espresso. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I always find it oddly comforting to imagine this sleepy little global village we've got going on. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge outside your home, still rubbing sleep from your eyes, and immediately regret not putting on thicker shoes. The frost clings to the grass, and somewhere nearby, someone's already got a fire going. The smoke curls into the cold sky like a welcome invitation. You follow the scent, not to a bustling bakery or a cheerful cafe, but to a soot-stained pot hanging over a hearth. Inside the cottage, your host, let's say her name is Matilda, is stirring a grayish sludge that smells better than it looks. This is pottage, a sort of catch-all porridge made from oats, barley, or sometimes wheat. It's thick, it's warm, and it's exactly what your body needs after sleeping in a room that's maybe 2 degrees warmer than outside. If you're a peasant, this is what breakfast is most days. Leftover pottage, perhaps with a chunk of yesterday's bread torn in, and if you're truly blessed by the culinary gods, a knob of cheese to go with it. And no, you won't be washing it down with juice or coffee. You get a mug of small beer, low in alcohol, high in, let's call it, hydration. Here's the reality check. You probably wouldn't survive this lifestyle. Your stomach's used to avocado toast and oat milk lattes, not lumpy barley goo and bread so stale it could double as a weapon. But you eat, and you're thankful. Because this, right here, is energy. This is fuel for a day of tilling, hauling, threshing, and whatever else the land demands. For nobles, the menu is, predictably, a little fancier. A nobleman might begin the day with manchet bread, a softer, whiter loaf that's basically the brioche of its time. He might also have some preserved fruits, or a slice of pie left over from the night before. The castle cook might even warm up a spiced wine, not unlike a medieval version of mulled cider. But even then, breakfast isn't quite the centerpiece of the day. In fact, for some, it's barely acknowledged. And that brings us to a curious fact. The word breakfast wasn't even consistently used across Europe until much later. What we call breakfast might have been just the first bite, or morning bread. Some people didn't even eat it, choosing instead to wait until midday. That was when the real feast began. Still, back to our little morning moment. As you huddle around the hearth with your bowl of gruel and your feet thawing slowly by the flames, something happens. You start to feel human again. There's something oddly comforting about the routine. The simplicity, the quiet. And if you're wondering whether all of this mush was actually nutritious, well, sort of. The grains offered some fiber, and occasionally you'd get a protein boost from eggs or beans. But it wasn't exactly a balanced meal. And forget about vitamins. Those came in accidentally, if at all. There's one particularly fringe theory that medieval folk sometimes flavored their breakfast mush with foraged herbs. Not just for taste, but for humors. You know, that delightful medieval belief that your body was basically a soup of hot, cold, wet, and dry elements, and you had to balance them by eating, say, nettles or leeks on an empty stomach. Historians still argue whether the typical peasant actually had access to enough food diversity to balance anything, or if that was just the kind of theory nobles enjoyed discussing while someone else did the cooking. You finish your meal, scrape the sides of the wooden bowl with your spoon, which, by the way, you carry with you everywhere because no one provides cutlery, and brace yourself for the day. No coffee, no eggs Benedict, just barley, bread, and maybe the tiniest dash of thyme. And so your medieval morning begins. The sun is barely peeking over the thatched rooftops now, casting a milky light over your sleepy little village. Or perhaps, if you're luckier, and much richer, a fortified manor house. Wherever you are on the social ladder, breakfast is behind you, but not for everyone. In fact, if you wandered into different homes this morning, you'd notice that not all breakfast bowls are created equal. See, in the medieval world, class wasn't just about land and lineage. It was quite literally baked into your bread. And the first meal of the day said plenty about your place in the pecking order. If you're a peasant, your breakfast was probably assembled with what we could generously call available resources. But if you're part of the nobility, let's just say your gruel has better PR. Let's start with you, the humble villager. You're waking up sore, tired, and already late. You grab a heel of coarse rye bread. It's dense, slightly sour, and crumbles in your hand. You dunk it in some leftover pottage, or possibly in small beer if you've got no stew to moisten it. The bread's dark color comes from bran and other husk bits, not because it's whole grain like your grocery store likes to claim, but because refined flour is far too luxurious for your coin pouch. Over in the manor, though, breakfast is more presented. The table may be modest compared to today's standards, but it's thoughtfully laid. White manchet bread, as soft as medieval flour allowed, is sliced beside a wedge of semi-hard cheese that has somehow survived the summer. There's dried fruit on the board, imported figs or raisins if the Lord is lucky, preserved apples or pears if he's practical. Some even serve meat, though that's more likely leftover cold cuts from last night's feast than sizzling bacon. Sorry. And the drink? Still ale. Water isn't exactly trusted in most parts, especially near settlements where waste disposal could generously be called creative. But the ale is lighter, cleaner, and brewed in such a way that it's more nourishing than intoxicating. Children drank it too, and no one batted an eye. You might be wondering, how did everyone get enough to eat? Short answer, they didn't. In times of bad harvests, bad luck, or bad politics, food got scarce. Even nobles could suffer if their land wasn't producing. And for peasants, breakfast might just vanish from the day altogether. You'd wake up, maybe chew on a dry crust or sip a mouthful of beer, and just get to work. Hunger became your alarm clock, and your lunch bell rolled into one. Historians still argue whether the strict meal schedules we read about were ever really followed by ordinary folks. Some believe that peasants just grabbed food when they could, between tasks, on breaks, or whenever the opportunity struck. Others argue that even the poorest communities had more structure than we assume, driven by agricultural rhythms and church-imposed fasting rules. There's a curious quirk in how breakfast was viewed. Among the upper classes, especially by the late Middle Ages, skipping breakfast was seen as a mark of discipline or even nobility. Eating early in the day implied weakness. Why would you need sustenance so soon unless you were doing manual labor? In some monastic circles, breakfast was only for the frail or ill. You, dear peasant, would have been considered entirely too eager. But, class judgments aside, everyone had their routines. For some nobles, breakfast might have been served privately in their chambers, possibly by a servant bearing a tray with warm spiced wine and a few wafers. Others might dine communally in the great hall, especially if there were guests or business to conduct. Food was always social, even if no one actually talked. And let's not forget the women. Their breakfast often came after the men's or was snuck in between morning chores, especially among the working classes. A mother might nibble on crusts while dressing her children or feeding chickens. Noblewomen, too, were expected to maintain a certain appearance of modest appetite. Still, you can bet they appreciated a warm bowl of milk or a slice of honey-drizzled bread as much as anyone else, just maybe not in public. Meanwhile, the kitchen staff, if you're lucky enough to have them, have been up for hours. The scullery maid has already skinned her knuckles scrubbing pots. The cook's assistant is bleary-eyed from stoking coals. Breakfast, even in its simplicity, is a labor of layers. Someone's been drying herbs all summer. Someone else has been counting eggs like gold coins. By now, as your stomach settles and the chill begins to lift from the air, you're left with one lingering realization. Morning food might be humble, but it sets the tone for everything else. You didn't eat much, but somehow it was just enough. Just enough to get through whatever medieval life has in store today. So here you are, belly somewhat full, teeth possibly not brushed, because, well, medieval dental routines are best left to the imagination, and you're sipping the last of your small beer. But something odd catches your eye. A child, not older than 6, clutches a mug too. She takes a sip and goes about her chores like it's the most normal thing in the world, because it is. Welcome to the land of breakfast beer. And no, it's not a wild medieval frat party. This is small beer, a diluted, barely alcoholic brew that was often safer to drink than the water bubbling in the village stream. It's brewed quickly, consumed fresh, and contains just enough alcohol to kill some of the nasties that made water questionable. Think of it as the medieval answer to both hydration and nutrition. Plus, it fills the belly. You'd drink it with your mush, your bread, your cheese, whatever you were lucky enough to have. Children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. Monks drank it. Even that one pig wandering the lane might get a sip, though hopefully not on purpose. But beer wasn't the only option. Depending on where and when you lived, there were morning beverages of other stripes. In the Byzantine Empire, some wealthier citizens sipped sweetened water infused with herbs. In North Africa, date-based drinks might be prepared to break a morning fast. And in the Middle East, some early forms of coffee-like brews began to take root, though they wouldn't make their way to Europe for a while. Still, for your average medieval European, the odds of beginning the day with anything caffeinated were basically zero. Coffee wouldn't show up in Europe until the 16th century. Tea came even later. You're not pouring a double espresso shot. You're lucky if your barley beer isn't sour from poor storage. And yet, here's the thing. People functioned. You haul wood, you churn butter, you till land, all on a stomach fueled by beer and bread. Not bad for something that takes 5 minutes to prepare and 3 days to ferment in the shed behind the house. But let's not pretend beer was a universal solution. Brewing took grain took land, and poor harvests hit everyone hard. During famines, even the brewing grain might be repurposed into food, and that, dear listener, left some very thirsty peasants. There's also debate among historians about just how alcoholic this beer really was. Some argue that small beer had a negligible ABV, maybe 1% or even less. Others think it varied wildly depending on who made it, how long it fermented, and whether or not someone forgot it in a sunlit corner. Either way, it wasn't the kind of beer to make you stagger. It was just breakfast. Quirky tidbit of the day. In some parts of Europe, beer was believed to carry medicinal properties. Monasteries brewed special herbal ales, and certain breakfast beers were spiced with wormwood or rosemary to invigorate the blood. Sound fancy? Sure. Tasted awful? Almost certainly. Historians still argue whether these breakfast beers were genuinely enjoyed or simply tolerated. Was it a cozy morning ritual or a grim necessity to avoid dysentery? The truth is probably both. Let's paint the picture again. You're seated on a low wooden stool, your shoes are off. A clay cup sits warm in your hands. Steam curls up from the hearth, and someone hums in the next room. A droning tune you've heard since you were small. The beer is slightly warm, slightly flat, slightly sour, but it's yours. It soothes your throat and settles the bread in your stomach, and for a fleeting moment, life doesn't seem half bad. You don't know what microbes are, but you instinctively trust that your mug of barley brew is kinder to your gut than the muddy well nearby. If you're rich, your beer might have been brewed with imported hops, adding flavor and longevity. If you're not, it's whatever your neighbor managed to cook up last week, and that's assuming he didn't overboil the grain into glue. Still, it becomes part of your rhythm. Wake, chew, sip, breathe, work. And while we're sipping slowly, let's consider one final medieval curiosity. Drinking beer in the morning wasn't just okay, it was often mandatory. In some households, even servants were entitled to a specific daily beer allowance. It was written into contracts. So yes, breakfast beer was not only accepted, but legally expected. And with that final gulp, your mug is empty. Time to move on. There are chickens to feed, cloaks to mend, fences to patch. But at least your belly's not groaning, and your head's not spinning. A little warm buzz, a little barley soup, and the faintest hope that lunch will be better. The morning bell tolls from the nearby chapel, its low, steady chime calling not just to prayer, but to breakfast. You glance up from your mug of small beer, brush the crumbs from your tunic, and follow the sound across the abbey courtyard. Because today, you're not a peasant or a noble. Today, you're a monk. Your sandals scuff softly across the stone as you pass through the cloister. There's dew on the grass and mist curling in the air like incense. The monastery is still, peaceful, ordered, and just slightly too cold. The kitchens have been awake for hours, though, and you can smell the oats simmering long before you see the steaming bowls. Monastic life runs on strict routines, and breakfast is no exception. Except here, you don't speak while you eat. Welcome to the world of monastic morning meals, equal parts nutrition and contemplation. Your breakfast isn't fancy. A bowl of warm grain porridge, maybe barley or oats, sometimes thickened with a little milk if the cow's been generous. A crust of bread, often yesterday's, is your utensil and side dish all in one. You might get some soft cheese too, bland, but filling. And if you're living in a particularly well-off abbey, a poached egg might make an appearance. But that's a luxury. Most days, breakfast is humble, predictable, and served with a ladle. You take your seat at the long wooden table. The hall is quiet except for the gentle scrape of bowls and the soft shuffling of robes. No one talks. Instead, a single monk reads aloud from a religious text, something to nourish the soul while the body gets its turn. This silence is part of your vow. You've given up idle chatter to make room for reflection. Your spoon hits the bottom of your bowl. You chew slowly, thoughtfully, everything in moderation, including the mush. There's something sacred about this simplicity. No spices, no sweets, no choices. Just what's needed, and nothing more. And yes, even monks had small beer with breakfast. It's practically monastic hydration. Brewing was a key part of abbey life, and monasteries became some of the most consistent producers of clean, safe beverages. Over time, some even developed famous recipes, though you're still centuries away from Belgian Trappist ales. Sorry. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Monastic orders had different rules about breakfast. The rule of St. Benedict, which influenced many medieval monastic communities, didn't specifically call out breakfast as a daily requirement. In fact, for much of the year, monks only ate one meal a day, typically around noon. Breakfast was often reserved for the sick, the elderly, or feast days. But feast days were frequent, sometimes suspiciously so, and they came with permission to bend the rules. A morning meal might include eggs, spiced stews, or even roasted meats. On those days, the silence sometimes relaxed, too, replaced with soft conversation or low singing. Historians still argue whether monks secretly enjoyed these loopholes a bit too much. Some believe monasteries used fasting rules creatively, treating fish as non-meat, and thus allowed, even when it was stuffed and roasted like a turkey. Others think the discipline was genuine, but the abundance of feast days made every other day feel like Lent light. And then there's the quirk that always raises eyebrows. During Lent, some monasteries allowed crocodile meat. Why? Because it lived in water and was thus closer to fish than to flesh. How often they had access to crocodiles is another story. Let's return to your seat in the dining hall. You sip the last of your beer. You hear the scrape of a chair, the creak of a joint. An elder monk slowly stands, "Thanks be to God," murmured in Latin, and the rest of you rise as one. Meal over. Reflection continues. You rinse your bowl in a wooden bucket of cold water. You stack it with quiet efficiency. The day has barely begun, and already your stomach is soothed, your thoughts are settled. Outside, the sun finally breaks through the mist. A golden beam slants through the chapel window and lands right on your face. And yes, you consider skipping morning labor just to stand there for a minute longer. You step out of the monastery's calm and into the chaos of the everyday world, where bells don't mark the hours with reverence, but with rules. And among those rules, what you're allowed to eat. Because while the monastery may have its feast days and poetic breakfasts, the average medieval household had to play by the church's much stricter calendar. And that meant one thing above all else: Your breakfast depended on the day. And not just what day of the week it was, but what kind of day. Welcome to the world of forbidden bacon. You're a villager again, your calloused hands scooping grain into a pot before the sun fully climbs the sky. You've got chores ahead, aches in your back, and a tight band of hunger just below your ribs. But it's Friday, and on Fridays, you don't eat meat, not even a sliver, not even the fat cooked into your barley stew. If it once oinked, mooed, clucked, or trotted, it's off the table. The church said so, and the church in medieval Europe doesn't negotiate on breakfast rules. Fish, though? Fish is fine, especially if it swims or flops convincingly. That's why your neighbor is trying to convince everyone that beaver tails count as seafood. You smile politely, stir your pottage, and say nothing. So today, breakfast is fish, maybe dried herring if you're inland, or eel pie if you're near a river. If you're coastal, congratulations, you've probably had more seafood before noon than a modern buffet. Everyone else makes do with salted fish that tastes suspiciously like old rope. And eggs? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Depends on the exact type of fast. The calendar gets complicated. There are many fast days, sometimes more than 140 in a year. Some are strict, others are flexible. It's like meal planning in Excel, but your spreadsheet is written in Latin and enforced by your priest. Historians still argue whether peasants followed these rules closely. Some suggest rural folk were deeply devout and feared spiritual punishment or social judgment. Others think the church's grip varied wildly depending on how close you lived to, say, a cathedral versus a swamp. Meanwhile, nobles had their own ways of bending the rules. Let's say it's Lent and no meat is allowed, but you really want that bacon. Solution? Reclassify the pig. Call it something else. Oh no, this isn't pork, it's, Lent ham. Just don't let the bishop hear you. One quirky tidbit. In certain regions, barnacle geese were considered fish because no one had seen them nest. The logic was, if it hatches in the sea, it must be seafood. And so, roasted goose might appear at a meat-free breakfast, feathers and all, while everyone politely ignored the honking. Your own breakfast, today, is safer. A thick oat porridge, maybe sweetened with a drizzle of honey if the bees were kind last season. A hunk of sourdough. A mug of, yes, small beer. You might nibble a pickled herring, pretending it tastes better than it smells. And if it's a major fast, you don't eat at all, not until noon, or later. Your stomach growls in protest, but the church insists the body must be tamed. You don't argue with God, or at least not allowed. But for all these rules, there's a curious flexibility. Local priests often made exceptions, especially for children, the elderly, the sick, or pregnant women. A tiny pat of butter, a single egg, a bite of cheese. It might bend the rule, but only just. Still, most people didn't obsess over the details. They adapted, got clever, found ways to feel full without drawing heaven's ire. Lent might mean almond milk instead of dairy, or a pottage bulked out with root vegetables. It was less about gluttony, more about endurance, and that's the secret to medieval breakfast. It was rarely about pleasure. It was about getting by, about having enough energy to haul buckets, chop wood, thresh grain, walk 5 miles and back before sunset. So the next time you consider skipping your morning meal, remember this. Somewhere, once, someone ate pickled eel in silence while pretending it was chicken. Because it was Friday. The morning mist hasn't quite lifted, and your stomach is already grumbling again, which is odd, considering you just ate a bowl of barley paste and chased it with small beer. But here's the thing. What you just had might not have really been breakfast. Welcome to one of the more confusing truths of the medieval world. The meal we think of as breakfast wasn't always seen as a meal at all. In fact, some medieval folk believed eating too early was a sign of weakness, a lack of willpower, a concession to gluttony. So, depending on the century, the region, and your personal level of spiritual guilt, breakfast might have been treated with side-eye. You, for example, are a craftsman in a bustling market town. You rise with the sun, trudge to your workshop, and begin planing wood or hammering metal long before your first bite of food. A small mug of ale might tide you over, but the first proper meal? That comes around midday, when the work slows and your stomach starts to win the battle. This noon meal is often what medieval folks referred to as dinner, the largest meal of the day, eaten around the 6th hour, give or take. That meant breakfast as a distinct meal was something of a gray area. If you ate early, it was often just scraps, a bite of bread, maybe a bit of leftover stew reheated over last night's embers. Historians still argue whether medieval people consistently skipped breakfast or whether the records simply reflect religious ideals rather than everyday behavior. After all, most written sources come from monks, priests, or nobles, not exactly the folks swinging hoes in frosty fields at dawn. The working classes may well have eaten something, even if it didn't get mentioned in the annals of breakfast history. There's a quirky little term for this early snack, jentaculum. It comes from Latin and referred to a light morning meal, something to tide you over until the real feasting began. Think of it as proto-breakfast before breakfast became a big deal. But in some places, and especially among the elite, eating before noon was genuinely frowned upon. One moralist warned that those who couldn't wait until dinner were like beasts. Another compared breakfast to lust, suggesting that hunger wasn't just a bodily function, it was a temptation to be resisted. You, however, are not feeling particularly beastly. You're just cold, tired, and in need of calories. So you sneak a chunk of bread from your apron pocket and chew it behind the cart. You're not sinning, you're surviving. And yet, there were exceptions. Travelers, for instance, often received breakfast early in the day, especially if they were heading out on the road. It might be just a handful of nuts and a lump of cheese, or it could be something more generous, depending on the host's mood and the guest's status. Soldiers, too, were frequently granted early meals. After all, it's hard to swing a sword on an empty stomach, so a bowl of oats or a hunk of meat might be served at sunrise, accompanied, of course, by the standard issue of ale or wine. In many towns, bakers rose earliest of all, lighting their ovens long before the first cock crowed. It's not uncommon to see them nibbling on a crust while they shoved trays of loaves into the glowing mouth of the fire. Was that breakfast? Maybe. Or maybe it was just habit. There's even evidence that shepherds, those lonely wanderers of the hillside, would carry little bundles of dried fruit and nuts to nibble as they followed their flocks. No one wrote hymns about their jentaculum, but it happened all the same. The truth is, the line between breakfast and not breakfast was blurry at best. Some mornings you might wake to hot broth. Others, to nothing but the cold creak of hunger. But as you walk the muddy path through your village, the smell of someone else's fire floats on the air. You catch a whiff of garlic. A hint of frying onion, perhaps. Your mouth waters. Your fingers tighten around the crust in your coat pocket. You tear off a bite, and for a moment the world feels just a little warmer. Breakfast or not, you needed that. Let's talk about rules. Not just the unspoken kind that tell you not to swipe your neighbor's cheese, or the polite nod that means, yes, you may pass the barley. No, these are actual ink-on-parchment food laws, and they don't just govern what you eat for breakfast, but how, when, and what shape it's allowed to be. This morning, you're in a town governed by a local guild. Let's say it's late 13th century France, and your job is baking. You rise well before dawn, apron already dusted with flour, and start kneading dough by the glow of a fat-covered lantern. You're not just making any bread. You're making regulated bread, because in this town, your loaves must weigh exactly what the law says. No more, no less. And if they don't, there's a hefty fine. Or, worse, public shame. One baker in England, found shorting his customers on loaf weight, was paraded through the streets with his underweight bread tied around his neck like a shameful scarf. Not the best start to breakfast. That's because bread was the beating heart of the medieval morning. Whether you were noble, merchant, monk, or peasant, your day likely began with it. And because it mattered so much, governments made sure you couldn't mess with it. And that's not all. In some towns, the color of your bread was also a class signal. White, fluffy manchit bread? That's for the rich. Coarse, bran-heavy black bread? The poor. Bakers had to be careful not to mix their grains improperly or sell rich people's bread to those who weren't allowed to buy it. Why? Because food equaled identity. And breakfast, humble as it was, had to stay in its lane. But the laws didn't stop at loaves. Cheese, too, had rules, especially imported cheeses. If a merchant brought cheese from another region, say, a soft goat cheese from Provence, it had to be properly labeled and priced. Fake cheese? A scandal. Stale cheese sold as fresh? Even worse. And heaven forbid you try to pass off sheep's milk as cow's milk without saying so. That might not ruin your breakfast, but it could ruin your reputation. And in the medieval market economy, reputation was everything. Historians still argue how closely these laws were enforced. Some say guilds kept careful watch, inspecting goods and punishing fraud. Others suggest many of these rules existed more as guidelines than gospel, and a clever vendor could always find a loophole, especially if the local inspector liked free samples. One quirky example comes from the spice trade. In some places, even a pinch of cinnamon in your morning bread could violate sumptuary laws. Those strange, restrictive rules designed to keep commoners from dressing, eating, or living like nobles. So if your breakfast pastry tasted a little too luxurious, you could find yourself on the wrong side of a morality fine. And then there's fasting. We already talked about forbidden bacon and Lent loopholes, but food laws didn't stop there. In some regions, you weren't allowed to cook with animal fat during fasting days. That meant using oil instead, a much pricier option. The result? Less flavor, more frustration. This led to all sorts of creative substitutions. Almond milk instead of cow milk, ground nuts instead of cheese, fish sausages instead of pork. If it vaguely resembled the original, it might pass, at least until the bishop came sniffing around. You, dear listener, are stuck in the middle of it. You just want breakfast. But first you have to make sure the bread is legal, the cheese is approved, the butter isn't banned today, and the egg didn't come from a suspicious-looking chicken. No pressure. You sit down with your modest meal. The bread's a bit dense today, probably because the miller had a bad batch. The cheese smells stronger than you remember. And the ale? Let's just say it's ambitious, but it's yours, and more importantly, it's legal. You chew slowly, letting the warm bread soften on your tongue. It's a simple morning, but as you tilt your bowl to catch the last trickle of barley broth, something sweet tickles your nose. It's not the usual farmyard air or smoke from a neighbor's hearth. No, this smells like cinnamon. And just like that, you've entered the rarefied world of sweet medieval breakfasts, where honey flows like gold and spices are, quite literally, worth their weight in it. But let's be clear. If you're tasting cinnamon this morning, you're not in a peasant's hut. You're sitting in a castle solar, basking in the faint morning light that filters through oiled parchment windows. Your robe is lined with fur, your bread is made from soft, pale flour, and your sweet tooth is about to be pampered. Sweetness was a luxury in medieval Europe. Honey was the most common natural sweetener, harvested with considerable risk from wild hives or kept by the few lucky enough to own bee skeps. If you're nobility, your cook might drizzle a bit over your manchet bread, or even stir some into your morning porridge, because why suffer through bland mush when you can elevate it? And then there are the spices: clove, nutmeg, cardamom. Imported across vast trade routes, these flavor gems traveled from India, the Middle East, or North Africa, passing through the hands of countless merchants before arriving on your table. A pinch of spice turned plain bread into a morning treat. A dash of sugar, if you had it, made your spice toast a marvel. Of course, sugar itself was wildly expensive. Some households used crystallized sugar chunks like medicine, kept in locked boxes and grated sparingly over meals. You didn't heap sugar into tea or cereal. You shaved it like truffle. One popular breakfast among the wealthy? Sops. Not the most glamorous name, but delightfully cozy. You'd take slices of soft bread and soak them in warm spiced wine or milk, maybe with a little honey or sugar stirred in. Think of it like the medieval answer to French toast, only without eggs, vanilla, or a non-stick pan. Quirky fact of the day. Some nobles hosted early morning feasts that included sugared almonds, candied fruit, and even sweetened rice. A Spanish princess once documented eating rosewater-soaked rice for breakfast, a detail that sounds strangely modern if you squint hard enough. Historians still argue whether these sweet breakfasts were common even among the rich or mostly ceremonial. Some think they were daily indulgences. Others suspect they were rare treats, reserved for holidays or when guests arrived unexpectedly, kind of like breaking out the fancy jam for company. Meanwhile, back in the real world, you, the everyday villager, might get a little sweetness if luck shines. Maybe your neighbor traded for a jar of honey. Maybe you find a patch of wild berries. But more likely your porridge is flavored with salt, not sugar. That doesn't stop you from dreaming. When the local lord rides past in his cloak stitched with silver thread, you can't help but wonder if his breakfast smells like cloves and apples. And yet, there are rare moments when sweetness trickles down. At harvest festivals, markets, or church events, vendors might sell honey cakes or fruit tarts. You queue patiently with your copper coins, buy a sticky treat, and take the first bite with reverence. Just one bite, and suddenly, the world feels a bit less gray. As the bells ring out again in the village square, you rise from your stool, wiping your hands on your tunic. Whether it's honeyed bread or plain oat mush, breakfast has done its job. You're awake, you're warm, you're ready. And if your fingers still smell faintly of cinnamon, well, that's a blessing. You stretch your arms, squinting at the slanted sunlight slipping through a crack in the shutters. It's later than you realized, and your stomach's rumbling again. But don't get too excited, because this next breakfast, it's made entirely from what survived the night. Welcome to the world of leftovers, the unsung hero of medieval mornings. You head to the hearth, lifting the lid on a soot-darkened pot. Inside, last night's stew has congealed into something less appetizing and more structural. A solid puck of barley, turnips, and mystery meat. You poke it with a spoon, it jiggles, you sigh. But this is breakfast. You set the pot near the fire, stir it gently with water or ale, and bring it back to life. Not fresh, not fancy, but it gets the job done. You ladle a few spoonfuls into a wooden bowl and start eating, blowing on each bite. It tastes better than you expected. Saltier, richer. The flavors have had time to mingle. Like a stew and a porridge had a long night together and decided to settle their differences. In most medieval homes, food waste simply wasn't an option. Anything not eaten the night before became breakfast. Bits of stale bread softened with broth, cold pies from feast tables, hardened cheese trimmed of its mold. Even the bones from last night's soup got boiled again, just in case there was one more drop of flavor to squeeze out. And if the leftovers were too far gone to eat, you gave them to the pigs, or to someone even poorer than you. Historians still argue about how widespread food preservation knowledge was among the general population. Some suggest fermentation, pickling, and salting were common in every household. Others believe these techniques were more specialized, passed down through guilds or tightly guarded by cooks in noble kitchens. What's clear, though, is that leftovers weren't seen as inferior. They were practical, familiar, comforting. In a world without refrigeration, every cooked meal was an investment, and reheating was the ultimate return. Quirky detail? In some places, the leftover breakfast became a sort of family tradition. In German-speaking regions, for example, farmers would save a bit of stew each evening specifically to continue the pot the next morning, adding new vegetables, herbs, or grains to stretch it out further. It was never the same meal twice, like a medieval sourdough starter, but soupier. Even nobles embraced leftovers, though theirs came with a little more flair. The castle cook might take last night's roast and dice it into a morning pie, seasoned with herbs and wrapped in flaky pastry. Or old fruit might be stewed into a compote, served warm over slices of sweetened bread. It was still second-hand food, but you'd never know it. If you were traveling, leftovers became your lifeline. Wrapped in cloth, stuffed into a pouch, yesterday's cold meats and hard biscuits were your breakfast in the field. Soldiers, pilgrims, peddlers, they all depended on what they could carry. A chunk of dried sausage, a bit of cheese too hard to cut without a knife, a flat cake, dry but dependable. There's even a record of monks boiling stale bread into a sort of mushy soup, flavored with garlic and herbs, and calling it panada. Not exactly thrilling, but surprisingly filling. You finish your bowl. It's not glamorous, but it's warm, and that matters. As you lick the last bit from your spoon, because yes, spoons were personal property, and you guard yours like a dragon, you realize you've got enough energy to make it to lunch. Maybe. Outside, someone's already sweeping the street. A dog barks. A baby cries. And you, brave eater of secondhand stew, are ready to face the morning. Leftovers, never glamorous, always essential. The morning's chill lingers, but you're focused on something else now. Your hands, or rather what they're doing. You're eating, but there's no fork, no knife. Just your fingers and one faithful, slightly worn wooden spoon that you carry everywhere like a favorite pen. Because in the medieval world, breakfast wasn't just about what you ate, it was about how you ate it. There's no proper dining set. You eat with your hands, your mouth, and whatever wooden or horn spoon you've managed not to lose since last market day. Plates? If you're lucky. Otherwise, it's a slab of stale bread acting as both dish and side course, what they called a trencher. Eat the food, then eat the plate. Sustainable and delicious-ish. Right now, you're crouched near the fire, spooning hot porridge into your mouth with steady rhythm. The spoon has a bit of a wobble. It was carved hastily, maybe by your grandfather. It's yours, and no one, absolutely no one, borrows it. In fact, the only thing worse than losing your spoon is accidentally using someone else's, a social disaster of epic proportions. And if you're wondering, didn't they use forks? Well, not really. Forks existed, yes, but they were rare, expensive, and sometimes even controversial. In parts of Europe, using a fork was seen as suspiciously foreign or even effeminate. Why use a pronged stick when God gave you perfectly good fingers? Historians still argue about when forks entered common use, but for most medieval folks, spoons and hands did the trick just fine. You glance over to see your neighbor scooping lentil mash directly with 3 fingers, balancing it expertly before delivering it to his mouth. No mess, no napkin, just muscle memory and dignity. Now, if you're noble, you might be handed a silver spoon, but even then, etiquette is mostly a matter of confidence. You tear your bread, dip it in honeyed wine, and pretend it's intentional when half of it falls into your lap. In noble halls, the wealthier guests are served on pewter or even ceramic dishes. They might have tablecloths, fancy goblets, and a servant to refill the wine. But let's be honest. A nobleman gnawing on a sausage link with one hand and tearing a duck leg with the other isn't exactly a paragon of table manners. Quirky fact of the day. In some courtly households, guests were expected to bring their own cutlery. That's right. BYOS, bring your own spoon. Forgetting it might mean awkwardly sipping broth from the edge of the bowl while pretending that's what you meant to do. And speaking of bowls, most were made of wood, pottery, or even hollowed-out horn. Break one? Hope you know a potter. Crack your only spoon? Better start carving. It's also worth noting that in communal households, like monasteries or longhouses, meals were eaten in shared silence or subdued chatter. Loud chewing? Frowned upon. Stealing from your neighbor's bowl? Strongly discouraged, unless you wanted to spend the afternoon picking turnips in shame. But the ritual of eating, hands, spoons, sloshing mugs, formed its own quiet rhythm. A kind of choreography repeated each morning without fail. You sit down, dip bread, pass the salt, sip ale. Your fingers get sticky, but you don't mind. The food is warm. The company familiar. Historians still debate whether this tactile, close-contact eating made meals more intimate or more unhygienic. Probably both. Soap existed, but it was precious. Water was cold. Fingers were often dirtier than anyone admitted. Still, you finish your breakfast with practiced ease. One final scrape of the spoon. A swipe of bread along the edge of the bowl. A satisfied sigh. Then, you rinse your spoon in a shared pail, dry it on your tunic, and tuck it back into your belt, ready for lunch. Because in this world, the spoon is your most valuable utensil. Possibly your only utensil, and definitely your closest breakfast companion. The wind picks up a little as you step outside. the last taste of breakfast fading from your tongue. You stretch your arms toward the sky, and the cold air bites at your fingertips. Time to get to work. Because if there's one truth medieval breakfast understood well, it's that food is fuel, and what you eat in the morning depends almost entirely on what lies ahead for your body. You don't eat for fun. You eat so you can carry that plow, chop that wood, grind that grain, and not faint halfway through. Let's say you're a field hand. You've got 6 hours of threshing ahead, plus whatever tasks follow after. Your body is a machine that needs consistent stoking, but you're not shoveling in calories the way modern gym-goers prep for marathons. Your meal this morning was modest. Some porridge, a wedge of dark bread, a bit of hard cheese. Maybe a few pickled onions if your family made some last fall. You start your day bent over, hoe in hand, shoulders already aching, the sun not even warm yet. And as your muscles begin to groan, you realize your breakfast was perfectly designed for this. Not too heavy. Just enough carbs to keep you moving. Salt to retain water. A bit of fat, if you're lucky, to slow the burn. Protein? Sometimes. But mostly, medieval breakfasts were built around the rhythm of labor. If you lived in town and worked as an apprentice, say a cooper or a weaver, you might have had more variety. Maybe a hot roll from the baker if you passed by early enough, or a warm bowl of ale broth with herbs. But your day still meant hours of repetitive motion, so the food stayed simple. Easy to cook, easy to carry, easy to digest. Historians still argue whether people in physically demanding jobs were underfed by today's standards. Some evidence suggests they got just enough calories, spread thinly across 2 meals a day and a light supper. Others believe chronic undernourishment was common, especially in winter or during lean harvests. Either way, breakfast wasn't for indulgence. It was for survival. Quirky detail? Some guilds actually required their members to eat together in the morning. This wasn't about camaraderie. It was about making sure no one passed out while sharpening swords or operating a forge. A fainting blacksmith is bad for business. And if you worked in transport, delivering goods between towns, you might have eaten on the go. A pocketful of cold barley cakes, a slice of salted pork if it was allowed that day, maybe a small flask of ale. Horses got more rest than you did. Labor shaped everything. Even children adapted. Young shepherds, for example, often packed a morning bundle of flatbread, curd cheese, and a handful of nuts. Their job? Walk the hills, protect the flock, stay awake. It's not glamorous, but your legs get strong. And your stomach? It learns not to ask for more. If you were a woman working in a manor or as a housekeeper, your breakfast depended on your employer. Sometimes you were served from the same pot as the master. Other times you got only what was left behind. Either way, your day would be full of scrubbing, sewing, hauling, and, inevitably, feeding everyone else before yourself. And here's the quiet truth of it all. Medieval people lived with hunger. Not starvation, necessarily, but hunger as a familiar companion. A normal part of the morning. You didn't panic at an empty belly. You just kept going, worked harder, focused, waited for dinner. So, as you plant your feet in the muddy earth and lift that sack of grain onto your back, your stomach doesn't groan. It understands the assignment. Breakfast wasn't meant to delight you. It was meant to carry you forward. The path you walk today winds through more than fields and barns. It curls through spice-scented stalls, humming markets, and the occasional surprising smell of something foreign. Because once in a while, if the stars align and your local lord's taxes didn't bleed you dry, your breakfast tells a story from far away. Welcome to the unexpected magic of imported breakfast goods, those quiet little luxuries from distant lands that somehow found their way into your morning bowl. Let's start with the oranges. No, not the ones you toss into a school lunchbox. These are smaller, rougher, and carried overland in baskets wrapped in wool to keep them from bruising. In Moorish Spain and parts of Sicily, citrus trees flourish, and if you live near a coastal port or have a well-connected landlord, you might just get a slice of sun in your breakfast, or a candied peel if you're really lucky. Then there are the figs, dried, wrinkled, sweet as molasses. They show up on noble tables or in the kitchens of wealthy monasteries. You don't see them often, but when you do, your breakfast turns from basic to biblical. A fig in your porridge? That's not just food. That's status. Trade routes like veins of cultural caffeine pumped foreign goods across Europe. The Silk Road might not have delivered directly to your doorstep, but its influence trickled down. Spices from India, sugar from Cyprus, dates from North Africa, they all played a role, however minor, in medieval breakfast. But of course, not everyone got the good stuff. You might hear rumors of strange grains from the east, or rich white rice from somewhere warm and impossible. In royal courts, rice pudding sometimes made an appearance at breakfast. Cooked with almond milk and sweetened with honey, it was served in delicate bowls and praised like poetry. Historians still argue whether such meals were commonplace or ceremonial. Some records show nobles dining on rice and saffron in the morning. Others insist it was reserved for special occasions, like Easter morning or the return of a victorious lord. Either way, you probably weren't eating it unless your name came with a title. Quirky fact. In some parts of Eastern Europe, walnuts and dried cherries were boiled into a thick breakfast soup. Rich in calories, long-lasting, and surprisingly delicious, if you could get the ingredients. And if you lived along the Mediterranean coast, your breakfast might include olives, fresh cheese, and even flatbreads brushed with oil and thyme. A very different meal than the barley mush of the British Isles, and yet still breakfast in its own right. But perhaps the most fascinating imported item wasn't a food. It was an idea. Tea. It wouldn't become a staple until much later, but early mentions of tea-like infusions start to whisper into Europe by the late medieval period. Herbal teas were already popular, made with mint, chamomile, or yarrow, and often consumed in the morning as mild stomach tonics. But the real stuff? The leaves from the East? That was a curiosity. A treasure, something a scholar might sip while puzzling over manuscripts. You, however, aren't sipping tea. You're spooning lentil porridge into your mouth and eyeing a neighbor who claims to have cinnamon. You're not sure if it's real or just sweet-smelling bark. Either way, he grinds it proudly. You tear a bit of bread, dip it into a cup of hot almond milk, and wonder for a moment what it would be like to live in one of those exotic places, where the fruit hangs heavy from trees and rice doesn't arrive by donkey cart but is grown just beyond your doorstep. But for now, your breakfast is still simple, still quiet, but flavored ever so faintly by the wider world. And that, somehow, is enough. The sun has climbed higher now, casting long golden beams across the wooden floorboards of your modest home. You glance at the last crust of breakfast bread still clinging to your plate and pause. Something's off. The smell, the texture. That faint, fuzzy patch you hope is flour but suspect is not. Because today's breakfast comes with a risk. A very medieval one. Food that can make you sick, or worse. Let's talk about bad bread and killer cheese. In a world without refrigerators, Tupperware, or expiration labels, breakfast is always a gamble. You wake hungry, you reach for what's left from the day before, and sometimes it bites back. Start with the bread. It's been sitting on the shelf, if you have one, for a couple of days. It's harder than a bishop's scowl and covered in what might be mold, or might just be stone-ground flour clinging for dear life. You scrape it off and carry on, but you can't help but wonder. Historians still argue how frequently medieval people got sick from food, especially in rural areas. Some sources suggest they developed strong stomachs, raised on rustic diets and regular exposure to interesting microbes. Others believe foodborne illness was shockingly common and often deadly. Take ergot, for instance, a nasty little fungus that grew on rye in damp conditions. Eat a slice of ergot-infected bread, and you might experience hallucinations, violent convulsions, or even death. Entire villages, especially in colder, wetter regions, fell victim to what was later dubbed St. Anthony's fire. Imagine starting your day with toast and ending it with a fever dream. Then there's the cheese. Soft cheeses turned fast, especially in summer. Without a cool place to store them, they'd spoil within days. Hard cheeses lasted longer, but even they developed mold and bacteria when cracked or improperly brined. But here's the twist. Moldy food wasn't always discarded. It was trimmed. scraped, smelled, prodded. If it passed the sniff test, it got eaten. Not because people didn't care, but because they couldn't afford to care. You sit now, looking at your breakfast, yesterday's bean mash, dotted with something blue. You pick around it, eat carefully, take a sip of ale. No time to be picky. In noble houses, the situation wasn't necessarily safer. Richer food meant richer microbes. Imported delicacies could spoil in transit. Creams curdled, fruit fermented. Even honey could grow mold under the wrong conditions. And yet, breakfast was served with confidence and occasional consequences. One curious note: some cooks believed that overcooking could boil out the rot. If your pork pie was suspiciously soft, just bake it again. Twice-baked bread was even seen as a kind of delicacy, though mostly because it didn't break your teeth. Quirky detail? Some medieval texts warned against eating certain foods in the morning because they might open the humors too early, especially raw fruits, which were believed to disturb the balance of the body if eaten before noon. So if your applesauce turns, you blame the stars, or the moon, or whichever planet governs indigestion that week. You, however, don't have a chart. You have a spoon. You eat slowly, watching for texture changes, breathing shallowly when the cheese gets close to your nose. The ale helps. It masks a lot, maybe even danger. Still, you eat. Because you're hungry. Because work won't wait. Because wasting food in this world isn't just foolish, it's unthinkable. And when you finish your modest, slightly suspect meal, you feel a moment of gratitude. Not because it was good, but because it was enough. Enough to make it to lunch. Hopefully. It's a feast day. You know it from the moment you wake. Not because the sun shines brighter or the birds sing sweeter, but because the smell of bacon is wafting through the air. Real bacon. The kind you're usually not allowed to eat before noon. But today? Today's special. Welcome to one of the few mornings when breakfast isn't just tolerated, it's celebrated. Your town is alive with activity. The bell in the church tower rings with a bit more pomp, and the baker's already set out rows of small, honeyed cakes on his stall. Children run through the muddy streets chasing geese, and someone is definitely overcooking something, but no one minds. This is what feasting looks like before breakfast becomes brunch. In medieval Europe, feast days happened surprisingly often. Major religious holidays like Easter or Christmas, plus the numerous saint days and local festivals, dotted the calendar like crumbs on a tabletop. These were the rare occasions when food overflowed, rules relaxed, and everyone, even the poorest families, got a bit more on their plate. And breakfast? It joined the party. You step into a crowded hall or maybe just your neighbor's smoky kitchen. The table is already filling with food. Spiced breads, pies stuffed with dried fruit, sizzling sausages cooked in dripping, and even, gasp, fresh eggs. Someone's carved a roast and set it out with thick mustard made from ground seeds and vinegar. Children dip apples in honey. Old folks toast with mugs of hot spiced ale, faces flushed. This is not your everyday porridge and small beer routine. But before you get too carried away, remember, this is also about symbolism. Many feast breakfasts mirrored biblical or saintly themes. Fish might be served in honor of a miracle. Bread in shapes representing holy relics. A custard tart might not just be dessert. It might be devotion. Historians still argue how widespread lavish breakfast feasts really were. Some say only the nobility and church elites indulged in full morning spreads. Others point to village records and market accounts that show a spike in food purchases during festivals, suggesting that even peasants found ways to join the celebration, however modestly. One quirky custom. In some regions, especially in Northern Europe, it was traditional to serve sweet, doughy cakes shaped like birds or crosses for certain saint days. They'd be carried in baskets from house to house and shared, warm and sticky, before Mass. And in noble homes, mornings after great banquets often involved something called a void. It wasn't breakfast in the strictest sense. It was a little something to fill the void left by fasting during the night. Think candied ginger, mulled wine, maybe a slice of cold venison pie. A casual chomp to hold you over until the real feasting resumed. You grab a trencher of thick bread, topped with soft cheese and a drizzle of apple syrup. You chew slowly, savoring each bite. The hall is loud. Laughter, chatter, someone tuning a stringed instrument badly. A dog noses around your feet. Hopeful, you flick him a crumb. Quirky fact, on some feast mornings, dancing began before breakfast ended. Picture it. Half a dozen villagers stomping merrily to a fiddle while still clutching mugs of ale and trying not to spill their porridge. You look around the room. Everyone's eating more than usual, talking louder, laughing easier. For just this morning, hunger feels far away. But you know it won't last. The next fast will come. The next plain bowl of pottage. The next stretch of gray mornings where breakfast is a crust and a prayer. So you lick your fingers, wipe your mouth. Take another piece of pie and hold it like treasure. Because today, breakfast is indulgence, celebration, communion. And maybe, just maybe, the happiest moment you'll have all week. The feast is behind you now. The pie crusts are crumbling, the candles have melted into little waxy puddles, and the morning chaos is softening into afternoon stillness. You sit alone by the fire, sipping the last of your ale, your stomach full in that rare, pleasant way, not overstuffed, just satisfied. But this time, let's not move forward. Let's look back. Because over all these mornings we've wandered together, through drafty cottages, smoky castles, quiet abbeys, and bustling markets, you've probably noticed something curious. For all its variations, medieval breakfast doesn't change all that much. Not really. You ate what you had, when you could, how your body needed. The rest, that was dictated by weather, harvests, holy days, and how loudly your stomach protested before the bell rang for midday mass. Even as the centuries turned and sugar came by the sack instead of the spoon, and coffee began to percolate through Venetian ports and Parisian salons, the first meal of the day remained stubbornly simple. A mug, a crust, a hope that today's bread would be soft, not stale. And yet small evolutions crept in. Grains diversified, trade routes widened, peasants began growing vegetables in household plots, towns built more bakeries. The rising merchant class pushed for better food laws, and sometimes, just sometimes, those improvements filtered down to the lower rungs. By the late medieval period, breakfast was slowly becoming a more expected part of daily life. Not always celebrated, but acknowledged. Some cities even had public breakfast stalls, selling hot buns, fish cakes, or thick soups by dawn's first light. Historians still debate whether this shift came from practicality or pleasure. Was it the rise in urban laborers needing early energy, or a cultural softening of religious restraint? Probably both. The medieval world rarely did anything for just one reason. Quirky final tidbit? In some households, breakfast wasn't just a meal, it was a performance. The lord or lady would eat publicly, surrounded by servants, as a way of displaying wealth, piety, or simply control. Imagine sitting down with your porridge while 5 people watch, one of them fanning your face while another offers candied dates. The height of awkward luxury. But you finish your day the way most people did, quietly, with gratitude. You tuck your spoon back into its pouch, brush the crumbs off your tunic, and step outside to find the sky turning pale blue. Another day underway. More work, more walking, more waiting for the next meal. And as you glance back at the firelight flickering behind you, you think, maybe breakfast was never meant to impress. Maybe it was just meant to hold you together. Now that our journey has drawn to a close, take a slow breath in and a slower breath out. Let yourself picture that final, quiet medieval morning. The hearth glowing low, a worn wooden spoon resting beside a bowl. The steady hum of life moving forward, not rushed, not loud, just steady, just enough. You've walked through damp fields and fragrant kitchens. You've shared meals with monks, nobles, farmers, and wandering shepherds. You've stirred porridge with calloused hands and sipped warm ale from a chipped cup. And you've done it all without hurrying. That's the thing about these old rhythms. They're not here to dazzle or surprise. They're here to soften the day, to cradle you into stillness. So if your eyes are heavy now, that's okay. Let them close. Let the crackle of an imagined fire settle into your breath. Let the gentle weight of wool blankets, or maybe just this voice, draw you deeper into comfort. You are safe here. No fasting, no feasting, no worrying whether your bread was blessed or your cheese was cursed. Just rest. Let this slow, strange, lovely history wrap around you like a shawl. Let it whisper that even a bowl of barley can carry centuries, that even the smallest breakfast can say, "You are not alone." Sleep well and dream in warm candlelight. End of script. Sweet dreams.